the policy and practices of Israel in establishing the settlements in the Palestinian and other Arab territories acquired since 1967 has no legal validity. And then at the end of the opinion, it ran through its findings. I won't detain you with them now, except to point out it reiterated these principles in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and notably also stated, as it does throughout the opinion, the court concludes that the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, have been established in breach of international law. Now, regarding these basic principles and tenets, not one of the 15 judges sitting in the ICJ registered dissent from these basic principles and findings. It can scarcely be said that they evinced prejudice against Israel, or that it was, in the words of Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz, a kangaroo court. Because if you read the opinion, and there were many separate opinions apart from the majority opinion, the separate opinions expressed profound, and in my opinion at any rate, undue sympathy for Israel in the course of their opinions. For example, the opinion of Judge Ruth Higgins, the judge from the United Kingdom. If the judges were nearly of one mind in their final determination, the consensus came not from collective prejudice, but from the factual situation. That is, the uncontroversial nature of the legal principles at stake, and Israel's uncontroversial breach of them. As Professor Dugard has already mentioned, on the fundamental issue, namely the issue of the settlements, it was a unanimous opinion. It wasn't 14 out of 15, it was 15 out of 15. Judge Bergenthal was careful not to call his separate opinion a dissent. He used a more subdued language. He called it a declaration. And as Professor Dugard said, he begins by saying there's much in the majority opinion I agree with. But then crucially, in the question of the settlements, he says, paragraph 6 of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention does not admit for exception on grounds of military or security exigencies. It provides that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population to the territory it occupies. And then Mr. Bergenthal goes on to say, I agree that this provision applies to the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and that their existence violates Article 49, paragraph 6. Well, that leaves, of all what are called the final status questions in Israel-Palestine, that, and under international law, resolves all of them except the one of the refugees, which obviously the court did address because it was addressing the legality of the war. But there's also no dispute whatsoever under international law on the status of the right of return to the Palestinian refugees. As I already mentioned, that's one of the tenets of that UN resolution on the peaceful settlement of the Palestine question, which gains near unanimous support in the international community. What's even more illuminating is all the major human rights organizations have issued statements clearly supporting the right of return. These are not radical organizations, these are not Marxist, subversive organizations. We're talking about Human Rights Watch, which, quote, urges Israel to recognize the right to return for those Palestinians and their descendants who fled from territory that is now within the state of Israel. Or Amnesty International, which, quote, calls for Palestinians who fled or were expelled from Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza Strip, along with those of their descendants who maintain general links, to be able to exercise their right of return. There's no debate on these issues. There's exactly zero controversy on, to use Gandhi's words, the fundamentals of international law as they pertain to the Israel-Palestine conflict. fundamentals on which there can be no compromise. It's interesting, and I'll leave it at that, to compare what the actual record shows with how it's distilled in the American public, or for the American public. So let's take the case of the famous Camp David Summit of 2000. And we all know the famous story about Prime Minister Barak's generous offer, which the Palestinians and all their fanaticism and blindness turned down. So what did the generous offer look like? Under international law, Israel has zero title to any of the West Bank, any of Gaza, and any of East Jerusalem. They are, to quote the International Court of Justice, occupied Palestinian territories. Gandhi says there can be no compromise on fundamentals. But Israel's offer was it would return 77% of the occupied territories immediately, and another 10% the Jordan Valley between 6 and 20 years. The question of settlements. Everybody agrees. No dispute, no debate. Illegal under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Gandhi says there can be no compromise on fundamentals. Israel's offer, it wants to keep 60% of the settlements and 80% of the settlers within its own territory. Jerusalem, under international law, East Jerusalem was acquired by war in June 1967. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. The ICJ says it's occupied Palestinian territory. Gandhi says it's a fundamental, can't compromise on principles. What does Israel offer? It offers the Palestinians sovereignty over a few outlying villages of East Jerusalem, the rest be maintained under Israeli sovereignty. Refugees, 194, the right of return and compensation. UN General Assembly every year votes in support of that provision. 194 votes 161 to 7 this past year, fairly typically. Unambiguous principle of international law, embraced by Human Rights Watch, embraced by the Amnesty International. What does Israel offer? On the question of the refugees, it offers a token return of some of the refugees. And Mr. Barak afterwards says, to quote him, Israel accepts no legal, moral, or historical responsibility for what happened to the Palestinian Arab refugees in 1948. That's the record. And I think that it's useful to both contemplate Gandhi's position, since he's supposedly a very reasonable person, look at the historical record, look at what Israel's offering, and decide for yourself who's being unreasonable and confident. Thank you.